Good morning, guys. Just want to say that first, your omelets, the pictures of your omelets were amazing. I hope that you enjoyed that, your family enjoyed that, and way to go. My family and I are going to be judging those throughout this week, and we're going to make our decision this Thursday, and I'll announce that in Thursday's class. And also announce where the drop off and pickup is for that bag of candy for the winner or possibly winners. So we are, discussing World War II in the end of. And as I bring this to a close, I want you to think about how America emerged as a superpower during this time. It became the country that we know it. As a world leader, one that is in multiple different organizations and heads those organizations that all begins after World War II. World War II was the jettison of America and what it was going to become. Production soared during World War II, and it created, as America fought a war on two fronts, the Pacific theater and the European theater, a growing economy and one that is going to forever change the world. So that's today's lecture. And without further ado, let's get started. So when we think about America in World War II and what it was able to accomplish, you have to go right to the home front. And you have to think about how the different peoples of America affected that outcome. And everyone really had a role to play, from children to women, elderly people. Everybody in this war, just like in World War I, war of socialism is an important part of it to victory. For African Americans, they're still facing racism. Jim Crow is still rampant in the South. They find themselves struggling for equality, but at the same time, too, working in factories and serving in the military and even in the Air Force with red tails. But widely, what you see is still, segregation within the military, treatment that is unequal to that of whites. This is a struggle. At the time, the heavyweight champion of the world, Joe Louis, who also did his part in serving in this war, was amazed when he went over to Europe and he found that sense of freedom. He actually was going to movie theaters and restaurants with whites. Well, the American government looked at that and immediately started to shift things and change things. Matter of fact, they forced France into segregating their theaters and their restaurants, which led to, obviously racism at home and now abroad. For Japanese Americans, internment and relocation camps, justice won't be served until 1988, as you guys found out, in the tune of $20,000. These people lost everything. They lost their businesses. They lost their homes. No money was given back to them. Matter of fact, when they left the camp, they basically left with the same suitcase that they walked in with in a bus ticket. That was it. So their lives had to start all over again. But again, they served in World War II. Also, matter of fact, the 442nd Regiment, the most decorated regiment in American history, came out of those relocation camps, which is just unbelievable. Women obviously faced sexism in American society at this point, but are also going to do their part by not only, again, being the mothers at home, but also going out to work every day and working in factories. So things begin to shift drastically. But even our relations with our neighbors to the south, Mexican Americans and Mexicans, we start to see that there is the return of migrant workers. And this process had been going on since the 1800s, and they became vital parts of the American fruit picking and vegetable picking industry. They were there; they were the pickers, and this allowed them to obviously make money within the United States, and then bring that money back over to Mexico, to and from, and it helped the American economy and these industries greatly. So America is starting to change. It is widely again expanding the workforce and who is working, and you see in that in African Americans and women, and Mexicans coming now as migrant workers once again to work in America. For Mexican migrant workers, the program I really wanted to highlight was the Bracero program, and it allowed Mexican workers to come across the border. And this was started in 1941 to get food production up again. And it did drastically change things. Now, remember in the 1930s, the Great Depression, grapes of wrath, the idea of Okies going out to California and the land of milk and honey and trying to find their way. Those jobs were few and far between, and they were needed in a sense for the Americans that were here. And so migrant workers from Mexico, again, and been going on since the 1800s, is then restricted. However, these restrictions are lifted because now America is fighting in a war, and those men need to be sent overseas, and somebody needs to pick the fruit and vegetables from these farms and these orchards, and therefore Mexican workers are brought back in. And this program will continue for the foreseeable future. Some of these things I've already stated for women, but what you need to know is that women, it wasn't just the idea too of women joining the workforce in mass numbers. But let's start there. Women started in factories again, and they were making munitions for this war and the materials to fight this war. And this was dangerous work in itself. You're dealing with explosives, but the other idea is the dedication that they had not only to this country, but conservation of food and the conservation of food effort and victory gardens and growing them with their kids and canning the fruit and the vegetables again that they're growing for the winter months. This was the sacrifice that women made, but it went way beyond that too. Women started to join the military in mass numbers, and what we start to see is that 250,000 women are going to serve in this war in various different programs. And these programs allow them to, join the Army or the Navy, and they work different things within these structures. You had secretaries, but you also had the idea of women and the auxiliary corps, where you would even have surveillance, where they would make sure that our shores were safe from invasion, and they also would help generals with the mapping of movements of soldiers and regiments to know where they were within Europe. And this was obviously vital to our plan too. But women do see an expanding role within society, and this is going to have an impact. It won't come directly after the war. We talked about this a little. Directly after the war in the 1950s, you almost have a return of the cult of domesticity, the leave it to beaver wife. But after the 1950s, brings on the 60s and radical shifts and changes that will lead to even the women's power movement by the end of that decade, as you see multiple changes in society. But women are also fighting for equality, and they've been doing this for quite some time with African Americans. And we saw these parallels that reach back all the way to the times of the early 1800s in the antebellum era and reform era. So we know that women have been on this progression for equality. And ultimately, in the end, the things that they do working in the workforce, Rosie the Riveter, the woman, the iconic woman flexing, we can do it. Women are starting to prove themselves that they are equal to men in society. As far as peoples, the last group that I want to address is African Americans. And what we see here, guys, is an extension of the Great Migration. This is the, kind of culminating time period where African Americans are moving from the South to the North in mass numbers, looking for the possibility of work in the American workforce, which was largely denied to them. But now, with all these munitions factories opening up in the North, places like Ford and Ford Motor Company changing their plants from making cars into making tanks and planes and munitions. There are jobs to be had. And that is where African Americans are going to come into play. They're going to move to the north looking for these jobs and economic opportunity. But what we also see too is that as they start to go north, there is going to be tension that is created, much like what we saw in the Red Summer of 1919 when we talked about it. These clashes between whites and African Americans begins, and it is not as severe, but it's definitely noticed. But African Americans are still, again, fighting racism, as mentioned before, in the sense of Jim Crow. But they also are going to really look at this time period. And Joe Louis talked about this, that when those soldiers came back from World War II, they had in their mind that they were not going to take no for an answer in regards to equality. They were going to do whatever it took to find ways to gain equality in American society. They felt that they had earned that. In many ways, in World War II, they were a vital instrument and part of the American victory. And therefore, they felt that they should have every right to equality. And guys, we do see some pretty drastic changes in American society. In 1948, Truman is going to desegregate the military. So we start to see gains in American society for African Americans, but nothing that we will see like compared to that of the 50s and 60s in the civil rights era and the civil rights movement that will transform the role of African Americans in society and bring on things like the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act that, for the first time on the books, at least legally, put African Americans on equal ground. And it stops Jim Crow and it stops segregation with that. And it also is going to attempt to end the disadvantages that many African Americans were facing in American society. But we see for African Americans a definitely changing role, and one that is much closer to equality after this war. So what I want to finish with is the end of World War II. And what we start to see, guys, is that Germany is obviously all but collapsed by the time that April hits. But what we have is, for America and many Americans, tragedy. FDR, elected to an unprecedented fourth term as president, will die in office on April 12th. Germany and Hitler will be all but over pretty much by that point. He will take his own life on April 30th. But what we see is what his work had done. He had taken us through the Great Depression, taken us through World War II. Americans looked at him as a hero. He could do no wrong in the eyes of my grandparents. And that's what he meant to American society. But we also see a world that's much different. We have allies in the Americans and the Soviets and the British who are going to be deciding the fate of the rest of the world. And there are a couple of conferences that you really need to know and understand. So the first one that I'm going to start out with is Yalta. And Yalta happens in February of 1945. So at this point, FDR is still alive, and it's a discussion of what post-war Europe is going to look like. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, is there, and you also have Winston Churchill, who is the Prime Minister of Britain, that is there. And they're just talking about what this world will look like post-war, what Europe will look like post-war. And in this, they're discussing as far as who's going to control what. And territorial concessions, it is said that FDR made towards Joseph Stalin at this point. But remember, the Soviets had done their part, in a sense, of helping to win this war. Now, the Soviets play at a different level than the Americans as they take over these places. Totalitarianism is spread to the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin is a vicious leader, a cold, calculated leader. He had killed millions upon millions of his own people. Matter of fact, it is estimated that Joseph Stalin, the responsibility of loss of life, is estimated 25 to 27 million people. Many of them of his own. He had his own concentration camps known as gulags in Siberia. So this was not someone who projects democracy or the arsenal of democracy. And we struggled with this too. I'm not going to deny that. Obviously, with our own internment camps with Japanese Americans and denying them citizenships and even stripping them of their property and their possessions. But like I said, it was a different level, much, much different level that the Soviets were playing by. The Americans tried to spread democracies in the world after this, using the Marshall Plan, trying to uplift these countries. And that brings us to the last major meeting, Potsdam. And this came in June and July of 1945. So FDR has passed away. That makes Vice President, now President, Harry S. Truman, with the decision-making power. But we've also discovered something else, nuclear technology. And we're going to use the atomic bombs to end this war in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Potsdam, it is decided that the Japanese will be forced to have an unconditional surrender. And in doing so, the Americans and the Soviets are talking about what this is going to look like after post-Germany. And it is Russia that has already invaded China and is sweeping through China and promising to join the war effort if there is a mainland invasion on Japan. That will never happen. We will use the atomic weapons to end that war, which also puts us at the decision-making power of what happens to Japan, which is strategically and still today is a major part of our influence in the Pacific. And to protect us in this impending Cold War with the Soviet Union and even China as it falls to communism in 1949. This world is going to be split into two, known as the bipolar world, communism and democracy. And America is fighting for its power, its place in this world. Both countries are. It is America that will win that Cold War battle. If you fast forward all the way to 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in 1989, obviously, the taking down of the Berlin Wall. But the Soviet Empire was one that was the foe of America for decades to come. And it begins immediately as this war closes. It really begins even at Potsdam. And you could see the tension between Stalin and our leader, our president, Harry S. Truman, even then. So with those things brings us to a close of World War II. And moving forward, obviously, we will be discussing multiple different things. And look who just popped in. There's Ella. Say hello, Ella. That's her blanket that she puts in her mouth. Yeah, I know. Gross.